So I welcome everybody to this session, and it's been nice going around in this festival venue and looking at all the enthusiasm around here. So coming straight to our let's unpack the question from the very beginning, like who decides the craft of writing, and maybe one of the implicit uh, inference we can make from that is there anything substantive about saying that this is good writing and this isn't? Or do we say something like the idea of what counts as good writing has just keeps changing depending upon the age we are in? At the same time, there are lots of great works which survive the test of time. So the paradox is there could be something essential about what counts as good writing. So I think this is a question that all of us grapple with. And given the fact that we encounter all forms of writing, whether it is on WhatsApp, on chats, on memes, new mediums are changing the kind of discourses that we are encountering. It'd be great if all of you who have actually, done writing and you have actually had your books read by so many people, tell us if you think there is anything, truly something out there that counts as good writing, or is it just something that is a definition that, is up for grabs? So, yeah, maybe we can begin from Carlo and Anindita and then Anjana. Yeah, maybe. Yeah, thanks.
Can I?
Yeah, Carlo, yeah.
Can I be chevalier and ask you to begin, or because I feel uncomfortable about being?
Is this on? Can you hear me?
I think you have to push it forward. There you go.
Yes. Well, since we're all novelists, I need to kind of, it's a very large question. So just to bring it down to what is a good novel, right? Because writing encompasses academic writing, nonfiction writing, all of it. There was a wonderful, if slightly contentious essay by Jonathan Franzen, who's a writer I really, really like. And he kind of categorized novels into two. He called it the status novel and the contract novel. And I thought it was a very good explanation for, the question you're asking. So for him, the status novel was a novel that's considered high art. And, the juries like it and the people who give book prizes like it. And if the readers don't connect with it, it's fine because the readers are Philistines. The contract model is a model in which the writer has made a contract with the reader in which you get the reader's attention and they buy your book. So you get the reader's money. And in exchange, you have to entertain them. And if the readers don't like the contract novel, then the contract novel is a fail because the purpose of it was to entertain the reader. So I think it comes down to the objective of the novel, right? Whether it's a young adult novel or a thriller or a mystery or literary fiction, they have to be good in what they set out to do. So there's no point having a thriller that is beautifully written with wonderful prose if it doesn't thrill you. There's no point having a great mystery novel with poetry if it doesn't intrigue you. So I guess it's the question of intent, and it has to fulfill the intent that the writer and the publisher, whatever, put that book out as.
Absolutely. I guess that's a very good question, I think. The question of this. First of all, hello. Thank you for being here. Who decides the craft of writing? The answer today could be Chat GPT, unfortunately, right? Artificial intelligence. We seem to be told that actually machines can write. But for the moment, I don't believe that because I think Chat GPT is learning from us. For the moment, it is the writers, but there are other gatekeepers that decide the craft of writing. One of them is creative writing schools. One of them is literary criticism, publishers, agents. So unfortunately, we'd like to believe that the novelist establishes a relationship with the reader, and I think the novelist should do that constantly, but the situation is obviously complex and more elements come in. Very briefly, creative writing classes have an ideological impact on the writing of an author. For example, in my experience as an Italian novelist who's been living in India for 12 years, and I write here as well, I see that my colleagues in Italy are influenced by creative writing schools that are dictated by the American model. So they're told things like show, don't tell. But hey, Italian culture, just like Indian culture, we're all about talking. We can't stop telling things to each other. We describe everything. I mean, Indians even more than Italians, they're constantly telling you how overweight you are as soon as they see you. And I know that because that happens to me regularly, being told that. So you can't teach, but there is an attempt to transform through the literary algorithm that is taught in creative writing classes. They are very successful because they have a model that immediately grabs the attention of the readers. But it's a model that takes away your identity very often. And that is why, luckily, especially in Asia, there is still the possibility of experimenting instead. And this is why a lot of authors are coming out from Asia, because they are actually more empowered, in my opinion, to own who decides the craft of writing compared to authors in the global north, who are captured by this trope of the creating writing and the agent and the literary and the publisher and the business and the copies and how many followers you have. And so you have then the Western market picking up, luckily again, authors that are freer in establishing their craft of writing because they're bringing back magic realism or certain movement that actually are not allowed to Western writers very often. And then you have literary criticism, and there you have another issue, and I'll try to be a little quicker, sorry, but the literary criticism has the problem that very often it's brewed, it grows up to incense those who are already incensed, and it has lost its capacity to search for new talent, and which is one possibility that those gatekeepers should possibly remember, that their role as literary critics and book reviewers, they have to look for novelties. They also have a contract with the reader, which is to bring them new authors. So I think that those are some of the people who influence, in my opinion, the craft of writing.
My take is a little different because I'm not a fiction writer. And I do mostly narrative nonfiction, which in some ways is a little more unforgiving because you have to stick with the facts. And what I've sensed mostly is that your writing is driven by the facts and the narrative that you're following to deliver those facts in a somewhat entertaining way to your audience. And to a great extent, the craft is self-determined and determined by critics, because I think it's almost a progressive discovery, and my own experience is that your craft is somewhat less honed for your first bits of writing, and then as you go deeper into the writing, you're actually forced to think more about the sentences and cast them differently in order to keep the attention of the audience. And I'm talking narrative nonfiction here, not like Anindita mentioned, a journal or a science book or historical perspective, which is written like a textbook or an academic book. So I think there is a fair degree of self-determination, and often the gatekeepers are people that you send the book to for feedback, and that could be a really smart editor who points out where there's flab in the writing or where the narrative doesn't make sense. So to an extent it is collaborative, but I think the bulk of it is self-determined. It requires a fair degree of discipline. Naipaul's one of my favorite authors, and he said that each sentence has to have a purpose. And I think that getting that right is a challenge. You have to work quite hard at it.
I just want to, because this came up spontaneously in the conversation, the role that Chat GPT could play in, changing what our notions of writing is. Because, when we are talking about sentences, for the longest time, people who practiced what we call as literary fiction prided themselves on the fact that they were the one who churned out great sentences and really had a sense of style. And suddenly we have a very empirical understanding of what style is. Style is just patterns and rhythms of writing which could potentially be captured by a computer. That's what ChatGPT, that's a promise of that. So given that scenario, like, what happens to the question of style in writing? Is style then going to reduce itself to merely a matter of imitation, which is, of course, every literary writer, every fiction writer has to discover his or her voice. But that discovery is merely, after all, a continuous process of imitation, of course, and a little bit of invention, which in a way is something that gets dramatized by ChatGPT. When you ask ChatGPT to write in the style of Hemingway, or maybe you can ask ChatGPT to write a style which is a combination of Hemingway and Kafka, and maybe that would produce a new style or something like that. So what happens to this question of style in our time? So
I guess it's connected to what you just said about finding the meaning in every sentence. I mean, so does ChatGPT, artificial intelligence, is it capable of creating meaning, or is it just parroting what we put into it? I've been writing about this in Bending Over Backwards, my memoir, about the relationship between technology and spirituality, and literature in that way enters almost in the realm of spirituality, an intangible capacity that writers have to evoke emotions and to evoke meaning. So I've been following this for many years, and I mean, I know that in Japan, the algorithm has written novels that have participated in literary prizes and have won. But to this day, we have not seen an algorithm that seriously competes, because there is obviously something missing there in the capacity to create meaning for the reader. I think that you wanted to... Go ahead.
I've been following algorithm and AI for a while now, and I think what the system spews out is what you put in, and there is a deep unconscious bias in what is given to us when we ask for an input. So hopefully that is going to be challenged at some point in time, because unlike a writer's bias, which you're willing to buy into if it's a writer you enjoy and whose work you enjoy, a system that serves a more universal audience, which is almost like a cookie cutter, will have far more questions about bias around it. And I think that will be challenged, or it should be challenged. Who's coded it? What are the kind of biases that have, crept in? How do they portray anything, whether it is feminism, whether it's race, whether it's inequality? And a writer is able to take a stand. I'm not entirely sure that ChatGPT is at that state where it can take a stand and will take a stand, because a nameless bunch of people have coded it in, and we're basically getting what they want us to believe, and whatever that collective is.
Yeah, obviously the algorithm inherits the bias of the programmer, so that's why there's been a lot of criticism. Feminists have explained why there needs to be reprogramming or women programmers, right, to do that. But I think it brings it back a little bit to the question of what makes a book a success, what makes a book a literary success or a narrative success. What is the special quality? And I believe it's still human, and it's not possible to program it yet.
Just coming back to, I think ChatGPT was a wonderful inclusion in the conversation. I think it brings us to the fact that what is good. The idea of what is good will also change with the idea that the reader is changing and the reading tastes are changing. So what was considered good photography 100 years ago, a sort of formal composition, the play of light. In the Instagram generation, with people used to seeing flat lighting, people being bombarded with imagery, now art photography is a kind of very pulled back minimalist photography, and that's considered good. So similarly, I think with readers and our, the audiences are overlapping, being exposed to, say, ChatGPT or a certain kind of writing, what they consider good writing, or then what makes a literary fiction novel, that changes, because that by its very nature needs to be different from what is now a kind of popular kind of writing. So I think we have to factor in the changing reading tastes also. Yeah.
I would like to sort of take that forward, because when we talk about changing reading tastes, and this is something we were discussing just before our conversation, we can actually specifically talk about the taste for fiction itself, as you were saying, like, and when you mentioned the contract model, like you said, when we go for a thriller, there's a contract that we should be thrilled, we should come out of it thrilled. If we read romance, we should be, come out of it in a certain way. Analogously, the question when we read what is called literary fiction, what are we looking for? I mean, my initial thought, because because of my PhD, I was not able to read for a long time, and even in my work. Nowadays, I read literary fiction to just calm myself down. So I actually have a very precise effect on myself that, okay, I just want to slow down and do something that, because that is the pace of which is very different from my work. And I think, at least for me, I have found out a very particular contract that, literary fiction fulfills for me. I don't know, what would you guys say? Like, how can fiction serve? What purpose it serves?
I suppose it's because literary fiction is supposed to give us, again, some sense. Very often we experience reality and we see how it does not make sense. And this is why novels actually bring us some meaning. And that's their role very often. But recently, and since you're a writer of nonfiction, we've seen that there has been a marriage of nonfiction and fiction in a narrative, autofiction. And so those barriers are thinner now, and there is a dialogue. But I think it moves in the same direction, because when you read Karl Ove Knausgaard or Elena Ferrante, who's clearly very autobiographical, you're again seeing that what a narrative, literary fiction brings to the life of the reader and to the author, I mean, it has done it for me, is some sort of meaning of what has happened and why it has happened. It may be wrong, very often it may be. There may not be an objective reality, of course, but at least for you and your readers in that moment, the way you have lived something and the way you have retold the story creates that sense of meaning. And that for me is the great inescapable necessity that humanity has for literary fiction, which it has always had even before writing, because we were sitting around the campfire for 3, 4, 5 hours, the time it takes to read an average-sized novel, telling stories to each other, entertaining each other, and making meaning out of the experience of life together, thanks to the great quality of storytelling. And now we have novels, and we have radio, and we have cinema, and we have all the other different types of media which don't compete with each other. They help each other, and they can perfectly cohabit with each other. It's all tools for our storytelling.
I want to add to that, Carlo, the idea that the very definition of what a novel is has changed over centuries. Since I think the first accepted novel in the English language was Robinson Crusoe, early 18th century. And Daniel Defoe, in his diaries and letters, has spoken about the time the book was out. Readers were really interested in asking him if the story was real. And around that time, novelists, a new breed of writers, took great pains to write books that would appear real, because verisimilitude was important. Taking on from what you say about sharing stories, the idea was that I'm going to share a story about what happened when I was stranded on an island for all these years. So novels needed to appear real, and that was the definition of a novel. If you ask any writer today, they would be terrified of that definition of a novel. They want the novel to, they want to underline that it's fiction, that it's not biographical. In fact, biographical novels are often considered, lower in status, because you want fiction to kind of take off and be in the realm of pure imagination. So I think that idea, I think Sheila Heti, who's a Canadian writer, wrote this lovely essay about how the birth of photography freed art from the need to be realistic, and then art went into cubism and so many new directions. Similarly, the rise of TV, I think, has freed the novel from the need to be pure storytelling. The best books you read today are so much more about character and vibe and just language and space. They no longer need to just be about storytelling. So I think change in media, writing is so closely related to what's happening, not just to readers and other places in the world, but what's happening to other art forms. Because if TV gets more sophisticated, the novel is pushed to move in a different direction. Yeah.
Yeah, that's why it's fascinating to see also, you say, how does it change our need for literature and how it can be circular and it can also go back. Because you think that maybe sentences, to go back to the discussion we were having about creative writing classes and the Anglo-Saxon cookie cutter that it imposes on you, then you think that you have shorter sentences and you only have to show and tell, etc. Then you have A Passage North, right? Ruth Pragasam, and you have the literary version of what Terrence Malick does in cinema, and you have the capacity to enter into a sense of time which accelerates and expands, and you can explore every single detail like Robert Musil. Speaking of writers who inspire you, inspire this author, and you feel like you can go back and you can find again a readership that wants again that sort of expanded time where we thought, oh, we're too busy scrolling, and so we want only short sentences, we want like micro novels written on iPhones, and instead actually no, we want to take our time to look at the window and look at an empty garden lot and smoke a cigarette if we're smokers and realize what that smoke is. And so it's still a changing process. Technology changes us. Marshall McLuhan taught us, the medium is the message and the medium transforms the society, but it's a constant transformation, sometimes with beautiful surprises like the return of meditative novels, for example.
So, to add to what Carlo said, the line is blurring between narrative, non-fiction, and fiction. As an anecdote, when my publicist at the publisher sent me back the synopsis for the press release, she called the book fiction. So, whereas I was writing non-fiction. So, I think if you are able to tell a story in a way that is engaging, it's easy to keep the reader. And it's really then, down to the craft of storytelling. But I do sense that there is a generational shift in how we consume information and the amount of time that we're willing to commit to reading. I think, I'm a much older generation, and when I was growing up, really the single largest source of entertainment was books. You didn't have Instagram, you didn't have social media eating into your time. You didn't feel the need to have an opinion on every tweet that went out, which is, completely meaningless. So I think to that extent, because a book is competing for consumption time, there might be a case in the future for a shorter novel or novellas. I'm a great fan of this Irish writer, Claire Keegan. She's absolutely, she's a delightful writer. She packs in a lot. I think one of her first early essays was published in the New Yorker, I think in 2010 or something, Foster, which then became a book. And that's really just 45 pages of the magazine. But she sets up the character pretty much in the first line. And is that a way to get a lot of people to start reading again? I think possibly yes, because there is a generation that will not spend time on a book that is 500 or 600 words, but is willing to commit time to a book that is maybe 120 pages. Not words.
This is happening already. I mean, I have, a friend who is a young, in her early 20s, doing a PhD in literature and SOAS, and she told me her theory is that novels now should not be over 200 pages. The definition of a novella was, or a novel had to be above 40,000 words now, and I think literary fiction especially had to be above 80,000, but that's all changing. You see a lot of slim novels now between 40 to 60,000, and I think a novella is 20,000, but novellas are not being published as novellas, they're being published as novels. So this is happening already in a pretty didactic way also, with agents or publishers telling writers, no one's going to read this tome,
Yeah, I think Claire Keegan's last book was in fact shortlisted for the Booker. Small things like these.
It's perfect.
And it's a novella. It's
perfect if it goes back to those 3-4 hours of the storytelling around the campfire, meaning 150, 200. It's perfectly fine. But one could argue also that as the commodity of deep thought becomes rarer, more difficult to find, the experience, the joy, the capital that we gain from entering to a story for longer is actually increased. So in the heyday of the novel, the late 1800s, let's say until the 1960s or 80s, you could expect to find that joy. And since our attention span has decreased, now that joy actually has increased because it's more rare to find. So I'm not sure that newer generations, the ones that, for example, I have a son who's 18 and he's learned to use what we call a smart box, which is you take the smartphone, you put it in the smart box, and the smart stays in your head, and the phone stays in the smart box, and then you concentrate and you read a book. So you get a lot more from your time in those 3 hours of full concentration. And there are techniques that can be taught in school. And I think this is what we need to do, just to learn how to use the technology. So I think that in a way, it's true that our attention span and the market will push us, and it's already pushing us in that direction, but there is something to be said about rediscovering the pleasure of having longer time with the story, of the story being so strong that a week later you will pick up the book and you still remember the characters, they bring you back in and you can't wait to go back in.
To an extent, I've also found that a lot of my friends are now just audible readers. So the whole transmission is ocular, which kind of goes back to the, fireside and storytelling days.
I think, I was thinking on this. One observation that I was making recently is that, I feel that there's a huge boom in the non-fiction industry, so to speak. When you have people like Yuval Noah Harari and, other people talking about humanity or history, large swaths of history and stuff, stuff you can buy in the airport. I'm kind of convinced that there's this, now there is this boom in non-fiction, whereas, and I think probably my diagnosis of it or my justification for it was that, literary fiction must compete with other literary fiction, but non-fiction in some sense is about that topic, right? So somebody writes about, Yuval Noah Harari writes about humanity, Peggy Mohan writes about languages in India, somebody else writes about corporate history in India. So I feel that sense of, just going to these different domains and becoming some kind of, just having a taste of that domain and coming out of it. I think I believe that there's a boom in non-fiction. I don't know, that's my sense.
It's true, definitely. I think, and lucky for you, I mean, there's definitely a boom in narrative nonfiction. I think it's so tied to this idea of this age of information that we live in, that people think when they're reading, even if it's a badly written nonfiction book, that they are improving their mind, that they are learning, that they're grasping new knowledge. Whereas if the question comes to what's the value in reading a novel, it's a hard question to answer. It's like, I really dislike when, people encourage, say, children to learn a musical instrument, saying it will make you better in maths. No, just learning the musical instrument for learning music is also, there's great value in that. So I think people need to understand what reading a novel will help them in some kind of objective way. But there are objective ways that I feel, apart from the pure pleasure of reading, that I think engaging with fiction helps you suspend judgment. It helps you become more empathetic as a person, because you learn, you train yourself to inhabit other characters. So I feel there are these objective reasons, but as a novelist, I feel I don't want to list them out, because I want people to engage with fiction, to engage with it,
Yeah, in fact, I mean, just it reminded me about, as you say, reading music for getting better at math and vice versa. You've got Bill Gates talking about which book he reads, right? And there's this sense that, okay, if you want to be as smart as Bill Gates, you better read all these non-fiction books that he reads to get a sense of, how to dominate the world and so on and so forth. So that's precisely, as you say, people get a sense of expertise, gaining some kind of expertise or, ability to talk about a new domain every time they read something new in non-fiction. So, yeah.
I think, to an extent, it's also driven by wanting to be successful. So one category in non-fiction that's hugely popular and lucrative for authors is self-help books. I think some of the best known writers in that category are really self-help books. So there may be no craft in that writing, but the reader feels that this is going to make him come close to Bill Gates or, have a shot at a better life and more opportunities. And this is his window to opportunities, which the schooling system hasn't provided him or his environment hasn't given him. It's almost like the YouTube of writing.
I think that nonfiction is a very wide category. Of course, there is the transactional relationship with the text, which is self-help. It's like, give me vitamins so that I can be better. But there is also memoirs, narrative nonfiction. And I think that my theory is that social media does have something to do with it. Because for so many years, we have been sort of groomed by social media to read people's lives, mini biographies made of posts. So we have developed a sometimes morbid, sometimes perverted need to have that life. And then you have writers who know how to do it very well and keep you in the story of their life and their experience for much longer than a post. So I think there has been a brewing of a readership in that direction, which has influenced literary fiction and has made this narrative nonfiction category, which I like personally, become much more and more important, because again, it connects to what I was saying earlier. It brings some meaning in a very direct way in our experience of life. And India is particularly the perfect setting for this, because since philosophically it has an understanding of the concept of Maya and of illusion, and understanding that what we perceive may be an interpretation, then literature and narrative nonfiction, the literature of your own life, is a perfect setting for that, because you understand that the story you're telling is not necessarily an objective reality, but it's your impression of your life experience while you lived it.
I think on that note, one of the other things that I was thinking we can talk about is the relationship between ideology and writing, one of the things, there's one school of thought which, at least I subscribe to, which says that literary fiction is something that goes beyond ideology. Maybe it critiques ideology in itself, because of its power to, transcend those boundaries. On the other hand, there is the sense that after all, because whatever fiction there is, whether it is literary or not, it is about real people and real societies, and that logically means they end up being ideological in some way or the other. So, I mean, what are your thoughts on that connection? And of course, we can extend that position is very much more clear in non-fiction, because in non-fiction you are anyway making your stand clear. You're not putting it in the garb of fiction anyway. So yeah.
I tend to shy away from any definition of art or fiction that insists on a single moral conclusion. That is not the role of art. The role of art is to make you think of questions, is to possibly lead you to a place and leave you there. Fiction cannot be didactic. So I think if you weigh down fiction with, okay, there's been a war in Sri Lanka and I need to tell people exactly what was wrong and kind of make my political viewpoint known. If that's the basis with which you set out to write a book, it probably won't be a very good book. Of course, as writers, you are influenced by political events and what's happening around you, but you have to distill it in a way that slows it down. We were talking about pace a lot, because art or writing is not toothpaste. It can't have a direct utility. So I think you have to trust the reader a little more to let them kind of make up their mind.
I think also we kind of underestimate the influence or the power of the reader. In my experience, no two people read a sentence the same way. There are courses on how to read, which actually lets you examine how you've perceived that particular sentence and how you could have written it differently, and would the meaning really change for you. So I think the reader, to a great extent, determines the flaws of a character in a way quite different to how the writer may have imagined it or built it in. So the reader's journey with the book is often very different from the writer's journey with the book.
I can just share my experience as an Italian, and ideology and in literature during the 70s and 80s. It produced great writing, but it also killed a lot of writers, because when you have propaganda of one side or the other in your mind. But I think that, as you were saying, I think that you are able to create literature and instill it with ideology when you're following your story, and then the ideology is permeated in the story like a sugar cube dissolved in water. So you don't see it, but it will be there because inevitably you have a point of view, you have an ideology. The moment you start seeing the sugar, it's a bit too sugary for your taste.
And that sort of brings me to another question, which I wanted to ask, because you talked about Robert Musil and the way he uses details in his work. Robert Musil, yeah. So, one of the things that I have always faced as a real problem in the craft of writing myself, in whatever little attempts I've made, is when you create fiction, you create entire worlds. So, for example, if you want to describe a scene and you don't know enough about furniture, then how do you describe the scene well enough, right? So, in all your work that you guys have done, how do you negotiate this issue where, you have to have detail in your work because it has to have a certain texture which makes it believable? And from where do you get that sense that for example, if you are writing a novel about fighter jets, then you should know something about flying and, being in the cockpit, like Catch-22 or something. So how do you negotiate that? That's just a curiosity for me.
Well, I don't think you have to do anything. Meaning, I don't think that you have to have description. Again, we are transforming. We are used to seeing landscape. We have such an overdose of landscapes on our social media. So the idea of recreating a landscape to wake up some emotions in you the way it would have done in 1879 to someone who cannot travel, who cannot see magazines, even at the time, TV. It's a different concept. So is it necessary unless, as you were saying, every single word of that description is connected to the meaning of what the book is about and what it can reverberate emotions or thoughts, or it makes sense within the plot. So it's not necessary to welcome the reader and go on for pages and pages about Russian agrarian reform, as in Tolstoy, any longer, because no one has patience, and rightly so for that, because again, we have changed. So I think it depends on the need of the author, and I think that if you don't want to have any descriptions because you only have inner description of the mood of the characters, it's perfectly fine.
I agree. I mean, you do need to do basic research and make sure you're not getting facts wrong. But it brings me to a kind of tendency now, which is quite irritating, where people, there's so much conversation about appropriation. So the idea that as a woman from India, I can't write a story in first person about a West African man. And I will be accused, or maybe if I was Carlo, I would be accused more. White men are accused more of this.
That's why I'm writing about Venice now.
That so say Carlo would be accused of appropriation if he wrote about a Tamil woman, whereas he's been here for 12 years and it is about the interiority. How boring it would be, and how reduced to just the documentary if we only write about what we know. We are not documentarians, we are fiction writers, or even for nonfiction, for narrative nonfiction, you should be free to, research, explore, and write about whatever kind of topic you want to, and not just what is closest to your biographical reality. And I think this is a conversation in film now, that only trans actors can play trans roles, or such dangerous things to say, but only, say, a black writer can write about black characters. And I think this is not serving the purpose of creativity or fiction, and it's very limiting. It's very dangerous.
It's wonderful, because this really has to do with what this topic of discussion is about. I was discussing with Mohsin Hamid recently about his book, The Last White Man, and he was very proud of the fact that a lot of the white readers were recognizing that he recreated very well the white point of view. And so he said, normally that is a cultural appropriation because I'm brown, he says, and I'm writing about the white person's perspective of the world, and he does it impeccably. So it's like, this is what the openness and the freedom of interpreting another human being's thought, regardless of ethnic, race, and nationality, it brings to you. It goes both ways.
So I do think that, a lot of writing is about having the eye and choosing what to pull out and what is relevant to your narrative. And that no two authors will have the same eye for the same topic. And, what you put in is really what your eye picks out. And so there is a little bit of a bias there, but really is as different as cheese and chalk for every single writer.
Yeah. I think I'll just, maybe we can wrap up, and take questions. But before that, what you said was very significant, because as you, on one hand, of course, it is about our interior, viewpoint, and in that case, it's just a projection of ourselves, and it doesn't matter. The description of the detail is just incidental in that scheme. However, when you mention cinema, you have these extreme burden on these directors to create all these period sets, where every detail is taken care of because it's such a visual medium. Whereas I think, like you said, fiction writers, fits both ways. They have to make it believable. And like I said, maybe if they have the freedom to write about a very different context, then maybe they can just, look up information and build that world. I mean, I would extend that not just to writing about characters, as you say. Imagine I wanted to write a historical novel about, 16th century Norway, let's say. I mean, then I would have to definitely build 16th century Norway, in my work. And I think as much if I can just do research and just figure it out, I think that solves the problem. So that's how I think.
I think it brings us to the difference between truth and fact. I think it's important to be truthful in fiction. Facts are in the realm of nonfiction and journalism. What you said, while I agree with it, it is still a very, kind of dicey terrain. I'm forgetting the name of the book, but there was a book about, I think, the American, kind of Native American community written by a white woman. There was a lot of controversy about it 2 years ago. Was it called American Pastoral or something like that? Because she had pretended to know certain things and then they were wrong. So one does need to be careful, but not, but I think that care more extends to interiority. You cannot lie about a character's experience. We all live in a Wikipedia and Google era. So if you get basic facts wrong, really, shame on you, shame on your publisher. Right? That's not something to worry about. I don't think it's a writer's job to, do a PhD thesis in the area that they're writing a novel in. But you have to be truthful to your characters. You can't pretend to know of, say, deep violence, deep experience, deep trauma. If you're coming from a place of lack of empathy or condescension, I think, if you're speaking down, for me, that's more egregious, being untruthful, than getting some facts wrong.
I don't know if it's truthful or believable, because truth is a very difficult word. So I think what's important in literary fiction is to be believable, which is very different from nonfiction, because reality is so unbelievable, which is very, very difficult to make it look believable, right? So.
Well, yeah, I mean, truth is stranger than fiction, but then you do have a book like, The Life of Pi. Is it believable being stuck in the middle of the ocean with, a tiger on the boat? Answer is no. But is it entertaining? Do you want to know more? Answer is yes. So I do think it's what the reader finds intriguing. And you may have sort of started your writing journey thinking that it's going in a certain direction, but what the reader takes from it might be entirely different to, the purpose you had for the book. And believability and I think the word is really authenticity. Are you authentic to your craft and to your characters and to the narrative? And that's probably true whether it's fiction or non-fiction. Are you staying with the narrative right till the end? And is your voice, consistent?